Hello. This video is going to be a bit of a mixed bag. If you're familiar with the ideas I normally have, it's also probably going to be, the last of its kind, at least for a little while. This is about capitalism again, the exchange value problem, the thing with exchange value. I'm pretty much going to be talking about my thoughts on this whole political subject, political theory, where it is right now. See, to start us off, I argue with libertarians. I don't agree with them on a lot of things. Right libertarians, and the argument, one of the arguments I like to come back to is this sense of like the inevitability of government. When it comes to decrying the notion of an anarcho-capitalist society or an anarchist society, or a society of any form in that sense, the pure market society, I criticize that idea because I think that there's a sense in which the market, there's an inevitability to this thing that we call government. There's an inevitability to it, and then there's an inevitability that the market is spawned and controlled by it. So, and I like to use this argument because I think the inevitability has, it has nothing to do with human nature in a moral sense. It's not because there's evil people out there, or because there's people who want control, or because of this or anything like that. It's even more fundamental than that. It exists simply because of information constraints. It exists because in a society of sufficient size, you're going to have to delegate certain roles to certain people to manage a society of a certain size that's interacting, right? A society of certain size that's heavily interacting and heavily interconnected. And that's where the reasoning lies. And I think, and I'm not going to get too far into that, but I think that is typically a pretty decent denouncement of their whole position. I think it undermines anarcho-capitalism or any formulation of capitalism as a governmentless thing, any form of anarchism as a governmentless thing. It automatically kills it because of this whole information constraint thing. You basically have to argue that the information constraints need to be completely removed, which can only happen if you have perfect information, which is physically impossible and logically incoherent. So, the inevitability of government, and I think that's a decent argument, basically, is what I'm trying to say. At the same time, and I've been thinking about this recently, especially been exposed to sort of other ideas that sort of, maybe my views have changed a bit, but I pretty much realized it's possible that the capitalist, the pro-capitalist, could use the same thing in favor of capitalism. They could use a similar kind of argument in favor of the market system and the exchange system, and they could look at it and say, well, look at this, that this is just as inevitable. It too exists because of information constraints. And I have believed, at least for months now, when I really thought about it, that yes, parts of capitalism absolutely do exist, at least in their current form, as a result of information constraints. So you don't need an exchange system for a society of small size. And this has to do with David Graeber's whole idea of the gift economy. Gift economies existed before barter economies, but they existed on a small scale because on a small scale, you don't need an exchange system to deal with any kind of information imposition, right? When you have a large-scale society with millions of people, what you're inevitably going to have is you're going to have large groups of people interacting with other large groups of people. And in a system like that, one of these groups, every individual in these groups can't possibly know what the interests and competing values and what's important for that the other group. And decisions, and because of decisions and delegation, you're going to have some individuals or some groups make decisions for other individuals and groups, and there's a great degree of dehumanization and separation between the decision makers, right? Like a person who is president, who's the chairperson leading the government, whoever they are, they're not going to be able to tell what all the specific problems are of all the people who he's trying to help. And that information constraint is where things like exchange and barter, they emerge from stuff like that, is because, you know, you don't need to necessarily know what the interests of a person or a group are. You know, you don't need to know specifically what's good for them. You just need to look at the prices and the quantities. You just need to look at whether or not they're making money, or whether or not you can make money off of them. You just use the money-making tool to decide what's right and what's wrong. It's a very, very simple and easy trick, and it exists purely because we don't have the information. See, if I had the information on what people wanted, I could just, you know, if I knew exactly, if this was a society with like 10 people, and I knew exactly all 10 of these people, and I knew them personally, then I know what they'd want. I know what's valuable to them. I don't need to trade with them because I already know what they value. So, you know, the trade emerges as a result of information constraints itself. And because I make an argument about how government emerges as a result of information constraints, well, exchange markets do as well, and I claim the one is inevitable, the other one should also be likewise inevitable, right? Or inevitable, and more like inherent. Inevitable isn't really the right word. It's more inherent. It's more fundamental, you know. Which and that sort of brings me to the topic of this whole video, which is with the whole issue with exchange, because I am under no, like delusions, unlike the capitalist worshippers, I think, that the exchange system is somehow perfect or flawless. There's so many ways that it could be manipulated. There's so many ways that it could be skewed. There's a fundamental error to it, which is that, you know, if there's this whole like idea, this Marxist idea of use value and exchange value, right? And I'm really sort of concerned with you know, this whole thing. Use value is, you know, pretty easy to understand. You know, you could ask a person, and use value has to do with more like inherent ideas of value and what is inherently good and stuff, and that's sort of another topic. But like, you know, let's say that you like apples, and I can ask you what the use value of the apple is. That's not a numerical thing, but there is a sense to which, you know, an individual can assess the value that they get from having a certain, being able to consume the object, being able to use apples, being able to eat them. Once you make it about exchange, it becomes about something different. Now it's not about apples, it's about this, you know, new good called economic freedom. If you can use apples to exchange for oranges or whatever, now it's not about the use value of the apples anymore. Now it's about them as a bargaining tool. So now you can, now this distorts, like this fundamentally distorts, or rather perturbs, the use value assessment, right? I can look at the values of all the objects that I want to possess, apples, oranges, whatever, you know, in as great detail as I am capable of, right? But once I start thinking of them as bargaining tools, it becomes about something entirely different, right? Now I'm worried about my future economic freedom. So I'm not just like, I'm not looking at like, you know, present or future use of these objects or these goods. Now I'm looking at sort of an extrinsic use that they have in giving me this thing called economic freedom, giving me this sort of giving me more options. You know, so it's not just about like what the object itself does or what experience it leads to, but more about being in a state where I have more options to get the things I want. And that desire for like economic freedom is what it's a very different thing. The way we think about it, the way we analyze it, the way we put value on it. You know, it's a very different thing than the use value of the objects themselves. Right. It's also a very like. It's also in a way a necessary thing because. Sorry. It's not I mentioned it's like a different thing. It's not a fake thing. It's not a thing that's like not real. Right. It's not just because it's separate from the value of the object. It's not that it's separate. It's different. But it's not an unreal thing in any way. It's a I mean, it's fundamentally a real thing because it has to do with this like evolutionary, um, perspective on what is going to happen in the future. So it does qualify as a need on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's like the need for some sort of safety or security or it's about being in that kind of state where you it's about being in a state where you don't have to be afraid. I know that's that's sort of how I'm conceiving of it, because when you're low on resources, one thing that's going to affect you is the fact that you're going to run out of resources, and it's going to be, you're not just going to be looking at the use value, you're going to be motivated in part by this, like our actions are going to be motivated in part by the fact that we are going to run out of resources later on, and what are we going to do when that happens? So this desire for this economic freedom has to do with wanting to be in a state where you're not going to run out of resources. Wanting to be in a state where resources are going to be available to you. You're going to have that sort of, there's going to be some sort of fluidity to the value field. Like you'll be able to get the things that you want fairly easily. You're not going to be you're going to avoid scenarios where you're going to be sort of thrown into paths of scarcity where you're not going to consume and you're going to miss out on resources, and then you're going to go hungry, and then it's a mechanism for avoiding, it's a mechanism for avoiding getting anywhere close to sort of bad paths. I said bad value paths. It's a mechanism for avoiding bad experiences. Let's just put it that way, because that the lack of freedom and resources could present bad future experiences to come, and this is a way of avoiding them, making sure that we're not getting anywhere close to them. So it's not a completely irrational thing, right? So this is sort of how I'm conceiving of it, and this is what exchange literally is, right? This is what happens when you think of apples as a bargaining tool, not as a use tool. So that's just like that's the crux of it, and one could argue that there's something flawed with having to be afraid or having to sort of maintain that security, but it's not flawed in the sense that it's inevitable. Like you need that. You need to be able to make sure that you as an individual aren't gonna gravitate towards some sort of location in space-time where you're going to be suffering. And that's what it honestly boils down to. And it boils down to that from an individual perspective. Or it could boil down to that from a group perspective as well. It doesn't really matter. But it's usually an individual thing. So the point I'm saying is there's nothing inherently bad about this concept of exchange. I thought initially when I heard about use value and exchange value that exchange value is inherently a flawed idea. It's not a flawed idea because it's still like exchange value itself still has a use value, basically. The idea is that the usefulness of it has to do with the usefulness of it has to do with it in the sense that it's a measurement of how close or far you are from like bad things happening to you. Resources running out and having to deal with scarcity problems. That is like what it is, Now, just on a baseline, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. The problems arise when you start to value one, where the exchange system dominates the use value of the goods, in and of themselves. When it starts to distort our perspective completely, right? Like, for example, and this is again another whole Marxist idea, you bring up the example of like when the settlers first came to North America, they traded with the Indians and they got the island of Manhattan for like a bunch of beads. And it's not hard to look at that and see an unfair trade because, because the amount of work that they put into creating those beads was not the amount of work that they put into getting the island, right? And, and of course there's all these like subjectivist arguments you could make and say like, well, maybe the Indians didn't really need the island. Maybe they were okay to part with it. Maybe this, maybe that. Maybe they were just You know, this is what they get for not knowing how to create beads, and so on and so forth. The problem is, you can't just be okay with just every scenario like that in general, because there's no way that every single trade like that is going to be fair, right? There is no reason to think that the settlers that traded the beads weren't doing so with their own interests in mind, and made that trade in an effort to make their own group, their own sort of organism stronger, making the Indians weaker. But the Indians weren't aware of this, right? And you know, there's a difference here. There's a difference if this trade were happening where the Indians and the settlers are both playing for the same team, so to speak. You know, there's a difference if they're both on the same side, if there's some sort of group selection happening wherein the well-being of the entire group, consisting of both of these subgroups, is the main motivating factor behind the trade. But it wasn't. You know, it could easily not have been, right? It could easily have been that this was just one group competing with another, right? And the problem is, just like with how evolution works, when it comes to the group selection and the group level, you can't always, you know, you can't cast away every trade as a fair trade when there's a group competition happening, right? Because there's a difference between, there's a difference between, you know, cooperative groups and selfish selfish groups. You know, there's a difference between altruistic groups and selfish groups, and this is them like group selection biologists like David Sloan Wilson and so on. These are the things that they sort of research and argue and say is that, you know, selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and everything else is commentary. And that's a very like important idea, I think, because it's manifestation of like the difference between a organism where the entire body is like functioning and there's a division of labor, and you know there might even be competing interests happening, but the organism is moving as one body with the interests of the entire body, right, as the main motivating thing. Whereas they're compared to, say, an organism that has tumors growing in it, right? There's a difference between, you know, healthy skin that's just working like healthy skin and healthy skin that has tumors sprouting out in it, right? Both, right, in both systems there is some kind of internal competition, right? You know, cells within our own bodies might end up competing for resources on different circumstances. You know, when the body's shutting down, for instance, there's going to be some competition. Some organs get, you know, blood and energy and others don't. At the same time, you know, it's very different than if there's a tumor that's, you know, sucking up blood and resources and energy that's trying to kill the body. Or rather, it's not trying to kill the body, but it doesn't care about whether or not it kills the body. It's living for its own sake of living. It doesn't care about the survival of the body. Now there's a question as to whether or not the tumor should care about the survival of the body, and that is where my own theory of complexitism comes in, which I don't want to get into right now, but just accept, for one, the premise that there is something wrong with the idea that there's a tumor that's trying to kill the body, right? You want the body to move as a body, and any kind of internal competition to be handled, you know, to be resolved with respect to the interest of the body as a whole, rather than any internal competition being crushed by some tumor that doesn't give a shit, you know? So I think there's an important difference there, and it's important to recognize the difference, you know, with how that works, with how a normal body works and how a body with tumors does. And you can extend that to the market system. Now, the reason I'm bringing up all these problems with the markets, like, whoa, this is so bad, the market's bad. The reason I keep bringing up all of this, you know, is to point out that I'm aware of all the problems. I'm just saying that what I started off with is the idea that there's an inevitable aspect to the market. You know, you could look at all these problems and conclude, well, we just shouldn't have a system. We just shouldn't have this competition. And I think this is a very naive idea. You know, just like the sort of idea of equality. I think a lot of left-wing ideas are honestly, you know, push comes to shove, they're pretty naive. If you, I mean, at least depending on who they come from, they're sort of naive, and just they don't make fundamental sense from certain leftists. You get this sense, you know, like what is equality, for instance, right? Like what is this extreme chase for equality? Like you can't have extreme equality. I mean, you can't have a general sense of equality. You know, you're never going to have an equality of profession, for instance. There's always going to be a division of labor because there's a difference between the brain cells and the skin cells and the liver cells and so on. Again, I'm drawing the analogy to the human body. And you could say, well, everyone should get the right to be the brain cell or whatever. Yeah, but not everyone's going to be a brain cell. It doesn't matter what the rights are. Rights are a legal construct. This has nothing to do with rights. This has everything to do with how the body actually works. There's going to have to be a division of labor, right? It doesn't matter, like, again, in a non-transient sense. Like, you could have everyone behaving like a brain cell at one point. Certainly, you could have some fucking organism that's weird like that. But at certain times and instances, different people are going to have to take on different roles because of just various constraints and problems that society as a whole has to deal with. You know, you're going to have to, some people are going to have to maintain the machines. Some people are going to have to clean the machines. Some people are going to have to do this. Some people are going to have to do that. You know, there's going to have to be a division of labor. There's not going to be an equality of profession in a non-transient sense ever. You know, the only way you can have an equality of profession is if you only have one individual. Then all the professions are the same because it's just, you know, it's just one individual who does all the things. So that's a naive idea. But people say, okay, well, you can't have a you know, division of profession, but you should have a division of private property or personal property. Okay, but that too is kind of iffy. Like, what does that exactly mean, right? Like, I have private property. Like, I have, you know, certain toys or whatever. We don't all want the same toys. You know, we don't all want the same products, right? So insofar as we're different people, we have different interests, we're already not going to want the same property, right? And, you know, we're already not going to want to have the same goods. We're never going to have the exact same goods. So people go, again, you can say, well, no, but it's about the right. No, it's not about the right. You can't have, again, the rights have nothing to do with this. They're a legal construct, right? They have nothing to do with actual equality between different agents within the state, right? There's no equality of profession. There's no equality of ownership of, like, what things we actually own. And you could say, well, people should have the same amount of money that they own. Okay, but even that is problematic, because what is money? Again, money is just that whole good called economic freedom that I talked about earlier. It's just the desire to have that, right? And you could argue that every individual should have the same amount, but the problem is, when you have a group, the economic freedom of the group sometimes restricts the economic freedom of certain individuals within it. So if I draw the analogy to the human body again, when the human body is shutting down, for instance, it preserves some organs more than others. It preserves vital organs first. It puts all of the blood and the stuff in the vital organs and forgets about everything else in a critical situation. Now, preferably we don't want to be in a situation like that where we have to start shutting down entire sectors of society, but we could be. You know, the point is there are scenarios that could emerge like that, and if they emerge based on the fact that there's an inequality of profession, that we have different kinds of cells and different kinds of tissues and different kinds of interworkings in the cells, not all the cells are going to have, you know, not every cell is has the same priority to live as every other cell. The brain cells more important than the non-brain cells. You know, the heart tissue and so on, more important organ than everything else. That's just how it works. Again, it's just like if you draw that analogy, you can't disagree with it. And that does mean, under certain circumstances, certain people are just going to be cast aside. There's no way around it. You know, there's literally no way around it. Like, you can't construct a body that doesn't work like that. You can hope and pray and just do our best to maintain a body that's always healthy, and that, by all means, we should do everything in our power to maintain that. And it's very sad that it might ever come to a point where part of the body has to shut down. But I'm just saying, the very fact that that it's possible, that it's permissible for the body to start shutting down, then there is going to be a hierarchy and a priority of preserving some individuals over others. And with that, your whole notion of economic freedom dissipates as well. So because economic freedom is just that. It's just like when you in a situation of scarcity, who gets what. Now, granted, this again, on a practical level, if you look at the world today, we have every reason to alleviate poverty and all that stuff because we're not in that kind of situation. We're not in a situation where the body is shutting down. We're in a situation where there's innovation and there's constant growth. There's no reason to think that there's no reason we couldn't create growth in such a way that all of the people who are alive get certain resources and certain accommodations. Like, why do we have homelessness? We shouldn't have homelessness. Like, that's not, like, the very notion of homelessness is like the idea of a dysfunctional body. So depending on how big it is, poverty, but it's just like, it means that there's like cells in the body that are just like malnourished or they're not dead, but they're dying, and the body doesn't give a shit about them for some reason. So it's pretty sad, and you have every reason to want to prevent things like that from happening within this body that we have. But yeah, so the point is, there's no real sense of equality in any way other than like a rights sense. There's no real sense of equality in the state, in the state that society occupies. So chasing equality doesn't make much sense. What you can do, shit, my nose is itchy as hell. What you can do, and this is what I advocate for with the whole evolutionary zipper idea, is that we eliminate. It's not about creating equality as much as it is about getting rid of those forms of competition and conflict that don't serve the well-being of the body overall, that don't serve the functioning and the they don't serve the group fitness, right? Which again comes back to that whole evolutionary idea of like tumors, right? See, there's certain conflicts and certain there are certain conflicts and certain errors and certain competition forms of competition that don't actually serve anything good within our society. They change the way that the societal organism works, but they don't help the organism overall. They help subgroups within the organism, and those subgroups alone, for their own purpose, right? It's like, imagine, you have your human body, and then imagine all of a sudden that your liver grows a mind of its own and decides to live for its own sake or whatever. It doesn't make any sense. It would destroy your body and cripple it if that happened. So that's like that is effectively what we're dealing with regards to some of the conflicts and errors that exist in society today. So what we're doing isn't what we're trying to create equality. At least that's not what I'm doing, right? And not in any kind of like ultimate sense, any kind of ultimate equality. I'm not trying to achieve some sort of ultimate equality. What I'm trying to achieve is I'm trying to eliminate the forms of, at least my theory, what my theory is doing is it's trying to eliminate those forms of competition that work well for individuals and subgroups within the supergroup, being all of human society, the whole planet, and I'm trying to eliminate, those forms of competition in favor for only those forms of competition that serve the group fitness overall. So this really boils down to having a good understanding of the difference between individual fitness and group fitness, right? There's just some competition that serves individuals within our group, within society, but that does not serve society as a whole. It does not add to group fitness, right? And we need to be worried about adding to group fitness, because group fitness is effectively group welfare. It's the same thing, right? We need to focus all of our energy on adding to this. So if there's any competition that seems to be, coming at odds with group fitness, then that needs to be eliminated or hindered or whatnot. And then, again, this sort of ties into the whole question of, what actually constitutes fitness at such an abstract level? We're talking about a massive group here, billions of people all over the planet, for whoever, how long. Who are we competing with? Who is this group competing with? We're competing with nature at that point. We're just competing with, like, the laws of physics and the scarcity constraints and so on. We're this mega organism, right? But like again, the issue is, Jesus, my nose. The issue is, it's like, yeah, it's sort of abstract and hard to define, and again, that's where complexitism comes in, and I don't want to get into complexitism, but that is what it has to do with, because complexitism, what I'm trying to do with complexitism is provide a sort of foundation for this notion of fitness and welfare, group fitness and group welfare overall, in trying to determine, you know, what it is and how it works, and how you can, you know, how you can tell the difference between a, you know, a group that is, you know, self-interest, sort of a group that is internally altruistic and is, you know, working for the benefit of the entire group, and a group that has sort of internal, you know, tumors that are fighting for their own survival. So it's about telling the difference between any kind of competition that serves the welfare of the whole group versus any form of competition that serves the welfare of some individuals within the group, right? The latter boils down to just relative fitness, whereas the former cares more about absolute fitness, because group fitness is a more absolute quantity. It has to do with humanity as a whole, whereas, you know, intra-group competition is all about relative fitness, which is actually another thing, because relative fitness and absolute fitness are related. You know, people will criticize socialists and leftists and say that's like, well, you know, you shouldn't be jealous or whatever. You shouldn't, like, look at other people and be, like, jealous of them, or, you know, you shouldn't be worried about the relative fitness. That's effectively what they're saying. You shouldn't be worried about the relative fitness between you and someone else, because that's just relative fitness. What's actually important is the absolute fitness, how the entire group is progressing. Yeah, but the problem with that is that that's a double-edged sword, because if you're worried about individuals who are on the losing end of the spectrum, worried about relative fitness, you should be just as concerned with, you know, the individuals that are winning the intra-group competition, because they too are concerned with relative fitness. They too are concerned with relative fitness. They're just winning that competition. But the fact that they're putting energy and resources into fighting that fight, rather than putting it into ameliorating group fitness, adding to group fitness rather than individual fitness, changes the value of what they're doing. If it's bad for any individual who's a loser of any intra-group competition, if it's bad for any of them to fixate on the individual competition rather than the sort of the group level, it's bad for any individual who wins an intra-group competition to fixate on the individual level. And I would say that a lot of rich people and a lot of successful people are doing precisely that. They are, you know, they are the causes and concerned with things like status and money and wealth, and maybe they don't even realize it, but to a certain extent, and this is undeniably just true, they are participating in a game that adds to their fitness relative to other people within the group, and doesn't necessarily add to the benefit of the entire group in the same sense, right? There is a trade-off happening with how they're doing that, right? They can add to their own fitness and still contribute to the absolute fitness, but the point is, the more they focus on their own fitness, their individual level fitness, that individual fitness will inevitably conflict with the group fitness, the group being the entirety of society. It will eventually conflict and create a trade-off where it could actually detract from the group fitness, the group overall. This is why a society of selfish people would never work. It would be a terrible society. It would completely break down. Society only works because people aren't selfish. You know, society only works because enough people are altruistic and they're attached and they form connections and so on, that allows for society to function. If everyone was just a sociopath, you wouldn't have a society. They'd always be undercutting each other to the point where they just want to live by themselves on an island. They wouldn't, like, actually... that society would break apart very easily. It wouldn't last. And then certainly not as long as an altruistic society. Remember, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary. So it's all about just knowing that trade-off. But anyway, this comes back to, again, the whole thing with individual and group competition, and the left is, yeah, the left, like, needs to know what they're actually after, right? They're not after equality. There's no such thing as equality in an ultimate sense. What they're after is eliminating the competition that is destructive with respect to group fitness. That's what they're interested in doing. And this, again, coming back to the whole idea of exchange, this mechanism is very apparent with how exchange systems work. You can easily abuse an exchange system. Maybe not easily. It takes intelligence, but it's not impossible to do. You know, this is why you have salespeople and businessmen and, you know, marketing, and you have to come up with gimmicks and all these ways to sell, which is just like, it's figuring out a way to create profit and get the most out of the consumer, but it's not really thinking of a way to get the most value to the consumer, right? And of course you could think, well, they can't do that because of information constraints. They can't worry about what the consumer exactly wants. They could worry about making their own product good and making sure that the consumers get that. But again, the whole problem is with exchange is that you always have room for people to cheat. It always creates room for someone to take advantage of the system and sell something. You sell something to someone that doesn't know enough, you know, take advantage of the consumer's information constraints, take advantage of a consumer who doesn't know enough, like the settlers took advantage of the Indians, you know, take advantage of someone who, take advantage of someone who doesn't know enough about the product, who doesn't know enough about their own needs, maybe. You know, take advantage of someone who doesn't even know what's good for them. You know, so on and so forth. But there's all these ways of taking advantage. You know, take advantage of speculators and home buyers like the finance system is doing, huh? You know, it takes a lot of talent to do, and intelligence, and you'd think it's like, well, if you can have all that intelligence and effort and energy, why not just put that into doing something that doesn't take advantage of people? So exchange always opens the door for cheaters, and it always opens the door for cheating. And it honestly just comes back to this, like, you have to recognize whether or not there's cheating and stomp it out. Make sure that it doesn't happen. Get rid of it, because it's just going to become this parasitic growth that kills the entire system. You know, inevitably kills the entire system. What's weird is with the libertarians who sometimes seem to recognize that there's cheaters and people who in the market that try to create rent and so on, but for some reason they think the government's always at fault, right? This is where the whole inevitability of government comes in and just kills their argument. But yeah, there's you know, and you could say that there's inevitability to cheaters as well, because it's just exchange opens the door for them. And this is why I say that this is why we need some sort of convergence of value, where people are always sort of motivated with the interests of the group, is always in there at the back of their mind. They have to feel it and know it and understand it to not cheat. To not take advantage of other people within the group when it's not necessary. You know? And again, this whole thing is just like, you have a society that's so large, you're going to have people who are disappointed. You know, you're going to have people who, you're going to have competing interests, and you're going to have people who get the short end of the stick. That's going to happen. You know, I have personal reasons to not, you know, like capitalism. I have personal reasons to not, which I might get into at some point, to not enjoy the way that this whole system's organized, because I don't think it's been very fair to me. But then again, I'm also a fan of the idea that just like, because the system has been unfair to you, doesn't mean that, like, it's unfair overall to the entirety of society. The system has to be unfair to someone. There's no way it could be fair to everyone. There's not enough information for us to be fair to everyone. And even if there was, there's still constraints. Like, you can't be fair to everyone. That's just a naive pipe dream. You know, you can just hope that the competing, conflicting interests always work themselves out. You know, it has to come down to something like that. You know, there's no other way. So yeah, I understand the problems with exchange, you know, very well, and rent seeking, and so on and so forth. And I'll probably have more sophisticated, maybe a more thorough understanding of all this, and a more thorough opinion and things to say once I read Wealth of Nations. and I might talk about that if I eventually do that. I don't know. But, you know, the thing is there, like Adam Smith knew that, you know, the real free market is a free market that has no rent. You know, it's a free market that has nobody getting something from nothing. But the problem is again, what is getting something from nothing? You know, getting something from nothing is cheating. It's the thing that I just talked about. It's, you know, it's getting the most value for yourself without contributing anything of similar value to someone else. But this comes down to how value works, you know, which comes down to what is valuable for the group overall, because it has to be, you have to have a notion of what's valuable to the group overall, what's valuable in a group fitness sense, to be able to tell and to be able to make sure that every single trade, every exchange, every interaction that happens is always serving the group interest. So it means you need to have a concept of group interest to begin with. And to have a concept of group interest, you need at least somewhat of a convergence of value. I think you can't, because you can't, like, if not every single person has the sense of, like, you know, we are human beings, we are humanity, this is what we need to do for our planet. If not every person is thinking that way, they're going to act like a tumor. It's like the cells in your body rebelled and decided to do their own thing. And I feel like certain problems coming our way, you know, things like with globalization and people becoming more and more interconnected with the internet and development and, you know, global warming especially, and having to fix problems like that, that all of that shit is going to, if we survive it, you know, if we can figure out a way around it, is it's going to foster a sense of you know, it's going to foster this, like, global community thing. And this global community thing is the convergence of value I'm talking about. And the more it happens, the closer we get to, like, the more it happens, the closer we get to, you know, a market that works well, I suppose. Because, again, we're not going to have no market, ever. There's not going to be a marketless society, you know. Socialist societies have not been marketless. There's no such thing as marketlessness. So, you know, we're going to get to a market that works properly when, you know, the people in it, you know, where there's no tumors growing, basically. We can weed out all the tumors and all the weeds and all the parasites and make sure that everything that grows for the benefit of everyone. As it should. Now, hopefully that convergence of value will be there. There was something else I wanted to say that I forgot about. Oh, shucks. Okay, well, basically that's where I'm at right now. I mean, I think again, I don't think this changes very much with respect to my, like, practical thing. I think, like, in terms of the best presidential candidate was still Bernie Sanders. I still think we should go more to the left and try to cancel debt and, you know, all the shit that the post-Keynesians say, basically. They're the only economic discipline that seems to be on top of these things. I can't, like, you know, being anti-capitalist has sort of lost meaning to me. I don't know if that's even a thing anymore, because I don't know if you can be anti-market. I mean, I guess if a market worked properly, you couldn't even, perhaps you wouldn't call that capitalism anymore. So perhaps you'd be anti-capitalist in that sense, but there's no being anti-market, you know, completely anti-market. You can't be completely anti-market. That's just not how anything works. And you can't be completely, because of information constraints. Again, just like you can't be anti-government because of information constraints, you know? So, yeah. I mean, that's what it comes down to, and that's probably where I'm going to leave this off. Food for thought. I mean, I'm just saying that, you know, there's no being against the market, and there's no being against the government. What there is making sure that the systems work well. You know, there's just the information constraints themselves. Unless we were to remove the information constraints and become some sort of mega consciousness, there's no way to really undermine certain fundamental aspects to the system. I mean, hell, even in feudalism, they still had markets, right? They still had a market system. There's always going to be a market system, you know? There's always going to be some sort of market system somewhere. You know, it's just a matter of making sure that it works well. And I'm very much in favor of this whole, like, analogy that people make where a market is like a garden, not like a machine. It's a garden. It has to be well tended and well weeded, and you got to make sure you kill off all of the sort of malignant, malign weeds and plants that fuck up the garden for everybody else. But at the same time, for the garden to actually be beautiful for everyone, we all have to have a similar idea of what makes the garden beautiful. So, yeah, I don't know. I think the convergence of value is sort of inevitable for David Graeber's whole gift economy idea. We could maybe have a gift economy once we're in post-scarcity and once we've come to this convergence of value and we have this idea of what makes the garden beautiful and what makes the garden shitty and kills it. Once we've understood that, right? But it is a matter of just us understanding it. You know, it's not subjective either, right? It's just we have to figure out what it is and we have to agree to it. And once we've agreed to it, and once we've all felt it and understood it, then it could work. All in all, it feels like a very gradual process. For the immediacy, I think, you know, there's no silver bullet, but we have to start, you know, acting in such a way to, you know, start weeding out tumors and things and aspects of society that certain institutions and so on that are clearly not working for the benefit of the garden, so to speak, or the overall body, you know. Anyway, yeah, those are my thoughts, and I forget the other thing I was going to say, but that's pretty much it. These are my thoughts on exchange value, and yeah, this is what I think. There's a certain inevitability to it. Food for thought. Comment below. Let me know. Cheers. Farewell.